Hello everyone, this is the Shientist. I'm bringing you the third series in this audio and podcast, the podcast and audios around everything and everything and anything that looks at and explores, focuses around healthcare science, healthcare research, science research, and health services research. So this is on in this series, the Shientist is going to be talking about a number of areas. Just to break that down for you, in this series, we're going to be talking about better healthcare and needs smarter science, research and laboratory investigations, science and the healthcare multiverse, population health and grouping vasculatures, faith, science and medicine, the perpetual link, and then we're going to be talking about health critically and gauging science with impact. And then finally in this series we're going to be looking at science, discrimination, ignorance, and healthcare indentation. This series is all about the molecular storm gauge, and hopefully, as you will know by now, these are all part of a Ztorm Libostics production. And to start off, I'm going to bring some perspectives on this subject, which is quite close to my heart, and it's actually something that was discussed in part, at least in some regard, and in some part in the first series, that series, as you know, was very much about looking at how areas of healthcare could be more integrated between healthcare sectors, and there was a particular podcast that an audio and podcast that was put out on relating to how electronic patient records could be used, could be more integrated and actually more also more sort of robust in at least one way or another. So let's talk about better healthcare needs smarter science. What do I mean when looking at this? And I'm going to look at this. I'm going to try and come at this topic, or this subject entity, focusing on sort of apart from the science and aspects of healthcare. I'm gonna put in some some understanding around again, a little bit of focus on toxicology, and a bit of focus around this what we call what has been referred to as sort of clinical science and biomedical science kind of conjoined, and also how these focuses have applications to healthcare practices. So I'm gonna sort of break this down for everyone, listeners, by providing a bit of an introduction, some aspects around this topic, with regard to sort of how there is a link between some focus around populations or specific populations, and then some aspects around application to practice, and then kind of a summary, and then again, as I have done with previous audios and podcasts, in the other two series, I am going to provide for all you dear listeners to a few further reading and references that you can check out at your own time, and at your own leisure. So let's start off. So a bit of an introduction. So individuals living in living or residing maybe in silo, maybe if not in silo, in sort of care home or those kinds of facilities, especially those who might be, for example, retired, or might be, for example, may have sort of health complaints or conditions or complications that might be perhaps a little bit overbearing between sort of the that sort of have a cause or an impact on the physical well-being or physiology, as well as for example sort of mental health. And what I mean by mental health is areas around for example, dementia, Alzheimer's, or Parkinson's, those kinds of conditions. And before we go any further, I want to highlight that I'm not an expert in those particular ologies, but I am. I'm going to throw out some perspectives in an effort to try and link some of those ologies with some of the scientific and evidence base, and that's what the Shientist is all about. So basically, those who might need who are individuals perhaps in the retired population or the older population, and in these particular facilities, they may require special care and considerations from those working in sort of have roles and functions between different healthcare sectors. That includes actually those from the sciences who might be, like, for example, behind the scenes, and also those on frontline practice. And this understanding has been sort of at least in part has been reflected in actually a document related to the National Service Framework for Older People, that was actually published by the Department of Health in the UK in 2001. The document is known in full, really, relating to sort of medicines for older people, so the document, or the National Service Framework for Older People, that was published in 2001, it sort of describes how to maximize the benefits, and sort of highlights really the advantages and the disadvantages of medicines, and certain types of medicines, and how to avoid excessive, inappropriate, or inadequate medicines use and by individuals living in sort of care homes and nursing homes, or those kinds of nursing facilities. And the document goes into the National Service Framework, though a little bit, I mean, we're looking over sort of 20 years now, 2001, though a little bit dated. With that in mind, it still has its has a focus that links to areas of best practice across different areas of sort of care for I guess care for older individuals and those approaching the sort of at least from a healthcare specialty perspective, it's those who are approaching sort of the geriatric sort of population. And so with respect to age, the most important, or at least in regard to this particular document or National Service Framework, and this particular this framework, with respect to age, the most important effect, the most important side effect, really, from any particular medication, medicines and sort of perhaps, for example, inadequate use or inappropriate use of these particular medicines, is that they can have an impact on different organs, different aspects of physiology, and different aspects of healthcare generally. So you'll know, listeners, that the some of the topics and things I've focused on, at least with regard to long-term conditions, long-term conditions, and with respect to a particular specialism, has been about a kidney care or kidney care practice, and this is owing to sort of the work that's come out from, for example, the organization, the Renal Patient Support Group, the RPSG, and also the works that have come out from the Kidney Disease and Renal Support Group for Kids, or KDARS for kids. And both of these organizations function differently and relate aspects of kidney care practice and doing a lot of support work, and sort of evidencing that between pediatrics and young patients, as well as adults, and those at least in the adult population going up to, for example, 60 plus. But then when we go into the realm of elderly and geriatrics, it's difficult because when we say 60 or 60 plus, generally speaking, obviously there are people who would make, for example, are at retirement age, but then if they're retired, for example, then they could still for example, want to be working. Then I guess in a way, in one way or another, do we refer to them as geriatrics? And most people in healthcare would probably say yes. But I'm not going to get too much into that. But I am going to say that these two particular groups, they sort of function and sort of support those across the young population, those who are from ages, for example, neonate, so 0 years old, all the way up to 17 or 18, and that's KDARS. And then the RPSG, or the Renal Patient Support Group, they really do quite a lot of work in their own right, in the renal space or the kidney space, nephrology practice, those kind of focuses, and really up to the age range really from 17 or 18. So those children or young people approaching or adolescents approaching young adulthood or adult side, and all the way up to 60 or 60 plus. Now, if and in the realm of those who are above 60 or 70, generally speaking, although the RPSG, as my understanding goes, they do have patients or carers who are trying to get an understanding of how to approach aspects of healthcare for a loved one, for example, in those who are above that age. Generally speaking, when we look at as far as literature goes, there are no actual particular support groups or organizations where kidney care practice is concerned that actually cater for the elderly. Geriatrics, it's kind of a sensitive area, because when we look at geriatrics or we look at the elderly, at least in the literature, what is out there, it relates in the kidney space or kidney care space, as far as the literature that I've looked at, for example, relates very much to those who are approaching end of life care or palliative medicine. And so, whilst that's the case, it's a little bit of a shame that there hasn't really been actual support groups or organizations are focusing more specifically or robustly to support areas of best practice for elderly through, for example, social media platforms, or actually so that carers, for example, can approach aspects of healthcare, at least to inform aspects of shared decision making. Now, and listeners, don't get me wrong, there's actually lots of literature out there from an academic perspective to put out so that understanding is provided from academics, from peers and academics learning from each other in the nephrology space from that population. But it's, as you can imagine, it can get very technical, probably very sort of kind of unapproachable for those who want to try to do best by, for example, elderly, those who are older and elderly around them, for example, and that's a bit of a shame. So it's important to kind of at least get this understanding that when it comes to kidney care or kidney care practice, for example, at least from what I've read and I've understood, is that certain medications, for example, can cause renal or I think they call it renal kidney or renal insufficiency, meaning that it can certain medicines can have an impact on renal clearance, or in some way or another has an impact, so it can ultimately compromise kidney function and void compromising the ability to void toxins from the blood through urine in a natural way. So actually, therefore, as I understand it, a renal I think they call it renal clearance. So renal clearance is affected, and that then causes problems in the genitourinary tract. So older individuals, for example, then in this context, excrete drugs perhaps more slower, because you got to I guess appreciate or understand aspects of physiology as well in this context, because metabolism and those aspects that are so for example vibrant at sort of a younger age and middle age. For example, in the older age, the metabolism aspect is actually sort of more can become a little bit more compromised, and this might be for a number of reasons. It might be ultimately, however, it could well be just because people are individuals, or people are just approaching older age. And the most important effect is apart from potentially where the renal function could be compromised. The drugs, older individuals who excrete drugs have to excrete drugs through through their kidneys via urine, as does everyone else. The challenge is that these certain medications can cause what we call what I've learned in literature at least, something referred to as a nephrotoxic side effects, and the drugs and the medications obviously in one way or another they're not particularly outrightly, for example, referred to or labeled as nephrotoxic drugs, but in the realm of toxicology, these would be referred to as nephrotoxic drugs or nephrotoxic medications, because they impede and impact on the renal function or kidney function. Some of that understanding and context can be has been highlighted by Garish Vandi and that team in 2015, and more literature around that I will highlight towards the end of this podcast. But again, the Department of Health in 2001 beforehand highlighted really how certain medicines have particular side effects, though the Department of Health has not really, and this particular National Service Framework for Older People back in 2001 in the Department of Health did not really highlight aspects of nephrotoxicity or use that particular terminology, because obviously the context is very much layman's, which is how it should be. But when it comes to the training of health professionals in healthcare, in those settings, for example, where where the elderly are being looked after or overseen from different aspects of their healthcare, that entity has not really been a kind of a focus from sort of a perspective where, for example, where the training of health professionals and even healthcare assistants, for example, in those settings could stand to have some advantage in aspects of their health, of their training, if that is understood to ultimately implement areas of best practice, and ultimately keeping on top of aspects of professional development, and when nursing care is absolutely critical in those settings, having an understanding around sort of nephrotoxicity, and I suppose aspects of toxicology as well, that could actually link towards their area of professional development as well. So an individual, I'm going to say now, individuals, uh, individuals or groups of people in these particular healthcare settings um, are normally stabilized with particular medications owing to aspects of the healthcare requirements, and whatever that medication is normally, or whatever the medication might be, whether it's to meet certain apart from meeting certain helping to alleviate certain healthcare complications. Excuse me. Medications, generally speaking, are to meet and be given or administered within a particular in what is referred to in aspects of pharmacology as a therapeutic window. Within a therapeutic window, so that basically the patients themselves don't actually suffer with any particular side effects, and don't have are not sort of impeded in aspects of their day-to-day and following administration of particular medication, and certain medications, even within the therapeutic window, will and can cause, and I'm not going to say side effects particularly, or harsh side effects, because they would be within a sort of a therapeutic window. But from a scientific perspective, definitely there is a scope where, depending on for example, and I'm going to use the word, this word quite loosely, is the fragility of an individual in those settings, for example, can be more kind of susceptible to particular side effects, because what we have to kind of appreciate and understand is that those in those particular settings might have, for example, apart from sort of fragility, they may have they may be susceptible to these to particular side effects, because of what is referred to as, for example, reduced muscle mass. And that's notwithstanding that those who have reduced muscle mass, that it should not be understood. It should be understood and not sort of taken as a negative, and that is to say that those who are elderly or in geriatrics, not everyone, for example, has that susceptibility and has a reduced muscle mass. I mean, for example, there are people who are older and they look actually much better than those who are in middle age and even younger. So and we should all actually be in sort of we should admire that, because they serve as good examples as generally how they've looked after, for example, aspects of their healthcare throughout. But I'm going slightly off topic here, but I'm just saying that basically those who do have fragilities and have reduced sort of muscle mass, for example, can be more susceptible to particular sort of negative therapeutic implications of certain medications, and that's why it's important for kind of the science aspects to come out into approaching specific ologies, so that those working in different healthcare settings sort of have some of that understanding that links with, for example, other areas of practice, for example, pharmacy and medicine. So so on this note, then there's, for example, another piece of sort of understanding I want to kind of throw out to everyone, and that is to say that apart from individuals having to take certain medication to alleviate certain health complications, etc., the effects or side effects, if there are any, that individuals might have, can develop, can bring onset or symptoms that that are very close to and depending on medication. I'm not going to say all kinds of medications do this, and so don't quote me on this. But certain medications can cause compromise to areas of health and healthcare, and bring on onset, for example, myocardial infarction or susceptibility to sort of myocardial implications, or respiratory tract infections as well. Some of that understanding or further understanding around that can be identified in a paper by Zhang and team in 2018. The hepatic metabolism of specific lipid soluble drugs or medications is also reduced to some extent, because there is a reduction in sort of liver volume, and again this is particularly important for medications with narrow therapeutic windows. And hepatic metabolism, generally speaking, it's not my area of expertise, or I don't really, at least, look at sort of in my readings, I don't really focus as much as I perhaps should around the hepatic side of physiology, but with hepatic metabolism, because of the function that the liver has in areas of metabolism before drugs and medications taken orally, for example, and get excreted through the kidneys and through urine, through urine through urine and rid toxins from the blood through the kidneys, for example. The liver has a very important role in aspects of drug metabolism as well. So as you can imagine, I'm sure that listeners might be aware now that in those who are for example, the elderly population, the liver can be susceptible to areas of side effects as well, and especially where, for example, where certain medication would have more than one, where some individuals in these settings, and generally speaking, when we look at the older population, are on more than one medication to sort of treat or focus on across different areas of healthcare. So so that's a bit of understanding, a bit of intro, a bit of understanding around a basis of toxicology, and in the realm of in the realm of kidney care and that nephrology space, and a link or understanding around nephrotoxicity. I'm now going to talk a little bit about sort of applications to practice, and I sort of have touched on that a little bit with a bit of a basis of science and that aspect. But let me put this into another perspective, where I've mentioned, for example, where certain medications, where some individuals or patients generally, as I've read some of the literature as well, that some patients would have or individuals in sort of the certain age populations, and for example would have to have would be prescribed or administered prescribed one medication, or one or two medications, maybe three medications, to treat a specific area or an ailment around a physiological ailment. And so that brings more susceptibility to particular effects. And we're not saying side effects that can potentially be harmful from the onset or from outright, but can actually cause problems perhaps further down the line. For example, apart from certain medications, there's certain, for example, diet and nutrition. For example, some people will can eat 5 times, maybe 6 times a day, and have light meals, for example. But there's no telling that even with that sort of diet, that the body and the physiology of individuals, even in those who are deemed as for example, not in the opposite side of elderly and geriatrics. For example, those people can be in who have sort of certain for example meals per day, that even with a good diet, that they could be compromising aspects of their health, because for example people say, for example, and again, diet and nutrition isn't an expertise that I sort of lay into, but those people, there are people who are very strict about diet and health and nutrition, which is a right attitude to have. But for example, if you look at those who are on plant diets, for example, and I'm not gonna pretend to be an expert in this area, and it's not my expertise. But those who follow a plant diet, for example, they are negating nutritional health that their body should, their physiology should potentially be having. And so, for example, and in that context, basically, where for example, even following plant diets or having five meals a day where everything is plant-based, for example, doesn't necessarily mean that the body is getting a good nutritional value in one way or another. It does, obviously, following a plant diet to some extent has its advantages. For example, it might give, for example, might prompt and encourage more energy in one way or another, but can negate or be a problem, can be a problem in at least some way, and that is to say that it might be that the physiologically speaking, the individuals might be suppressing in some way a sort of area of health that their body might that their physiology might benefit from or find advantageous from, be more advantageous for, if they for example had certain sort of for example certain types of like meat that's prepared in a proper way. And again, I'm not gonna delve into this because it's not my expertise, but in this context, though, where individuals or patients in areas of who are more potentially more elderly, and actually across population health generally speaking, when there are more than one or two medications, or maybe between 3 and 5, or more, for example, to treat a particular conditions or health. That's referred to as I've known, as I've come to understand, as polypharmacy. And polypharmacy is commonly experienced by individuals actually living in those sort of nursing and care home facilities, and is often and in treating those, or looking to treat and seeking to treat those individuals, patients, individuals in those settings can have multimorbidities, comorbidities, or multimorbidities, and that is so in this context, this is where polypharmacy is sort of it's an area of healthcare practice that kind of aligns more around focuses of what pharmacists are about and should be about, to try and review aspects of patients' medicines, but even in literature, there's also some focuses around something referred to as so if patients are on several medications that could potentially warrant and prompt sort of ill side effects. There is literature out there, dear listeners, to actually highlight that deprescribing is something that should be prompted, but it's not actively or proactively implemented. So and this is mainly because pharmacists, as good as they are in areas of practice is what they do, they do not have, I'm going to say open quote and close quote, do not have sort of the power to withdraw areas of medication that can cause these sort of ill side effects. Most decisions in that context have to be aligned to general practice or general practitioners, and science, as far as healthcare professionals are concerned. The science are involved sort of to help highlight those where medication or certain medications that have to be monitored. For example, dear listeners, you probably will know about, for example, digoxin, which is an effective medication to actually to warrant off certain aspects of pain, but has other uses as well, and obviously there are where it needs to be sort of monitored. It is the scientists sort of in the laboratories where they actually look to monitor the apart from the efficacy and in meeting with the therapeutic window where it's where that drug is being safely used or administered. They also can identify when that medication is actually apart from being apart from having potentially causing problems with side effects to some extent, they can monitor the area under the curve, which is basically where that area under the curve is where they can say they can highlight that the drug has can cause it has its efficacy, obviously, and it has its potency, but there is that area under the curve, anything outside of that, for example, and they can highlight if it's being misused as well, or and they can do certain investigations to investigate how that can has happened, for example. It becomes problematic also if certain medications, at least where applications to practice are concerned, it becomes problematic if drawbacks and risks are experienced by individuals, and they outweigh, and those are outweigh and sort of more cause more compromise to areas of health than actually bringing potential benefits. And in this context as well, there is some areas in healthcare that can actually help patients and patients in at least ensuring that the patients get the appropriate dosages at the right times. And there's technology out there that can actually sort of help professionals in those kinds of healthcare settings for those in older and elderly and geriatrics, etc. In those care facilities, but and they have their place, and they're warranted in some regard, but and I think listeners you might be also aware that there are aspects of data science techniques that can also help improve aspects of healthcare. But that being said, nothing sort of really beats ensuring that the professionals are able to implement areas of their professionalism and professional practice, so that they apart from using what would be helpful technology and aspects of data science and certain aspects of toolkits, etc., to implement aspects of healthcare healthcare excellence, they can actually and should be sort of prompted to implement areas of healthcare educational practice, so that they're, for example, they can question why patients or individuals need to have, for example, medications every either every 4 hours, or every 8 hours, or every other day, or so on and so forth, because what we have to appreciate is that it is a collaborative effort in those settings, but with that in mind, educational practices are still are important in those particular settings. So with regard to, as far as I've read in literature and understood in literature, there is the use of sort of these nephrotoxic medicines, which cannot always be withdrawn, because sometimes these medications are the only medications that are effective to treat particular areas of healthcare and physiology, and so there is research out there to highlight how these medications can be monitored better, and inappropriate use can be sort of pinpointed much earlier than in sort of times before. Similarly, individuals with who might have renal impairment or kidney impairment might benefit from dose adjustments. If that's the case, that's something only I guess pharmacists and general practitioners can sort of have a discussion about, and have focuses around in what would be referred to as multidisciplinary sort of team meetings, etc. There should be consideration as to whether individual might benefit from sort of renal or kidney care screening, and in this context, literature there is quite a lot of literature out there to highlight certain screening methodologies, and what are referred to as particular biomarkers to help help monitor renal function, and in laboratories, the main one is something called or referred to as creatinine, and it's a main biomarker for to determine renal function and clearance, there are others out there, other biomarkers, but they're not so much in the mainstream as creatinine. And creatinine, for example, is a biomarker that is physiologically is a byproduct of muscle breakdown, and it has been used in renal physiology. In renal physiology, and to determine renal function in over 3 decades, really, and it's quite commonly used. The disadvantages around that, though, as you might be aware, listeners, that different biomarkers might, if there were more available, they might have more. There might well be certain populations, health populations, certain age groups that might benefit from other renal screening biomarkers versus creatinine alone, because some of the other biomarkers are potentially more specific to age groups, and whereas creatinine clearance, it can give sort of a kind of a negative imposition, if, for example, there are people out there apart from those who are, for example, elderly or in geriatrics, which for all intents and purposes, for example, you get those who if it's for example a byproduct of muscle breakdown, then those who are fragile or kind of have sort of don't have as much sort of mass on them, for example, that can potentially give sort of a negative imposition on renal function, when actually renal function could be very good. and in most cases it would be. But in those, for example, who are, for example, bodybuilders, weightlifters, power lifters, those who are amputees, those who might be proactive in other ways, or kind of in other populations, even those, for example, the younger patients or younger individuals, creatinine might not necessarily now, at least from some of the readings that I've done, might not be appropriate. So there are other biomarkers that are out there, but they are not in the they're not in the mainstream. In some parts of the world, for example, there's a biomarker called cystatin C, that's quite used quite a lot. And there's another biomarker that I've read in literature, for example, it's called FGF23. And it's kind of a sort of a growth, is kind of really a sort of relatable to a growth, a kind of a growth hormone, or has an impact in relating to growth hormone. But in this context, or at least where renal function is concerned, or to determine renal function, is probably best suited to be used, can be implemented in, or should be implemented, if there were more studies to provide the evidence around this. For example, in pediatrics or young people, but it's not really, there's not really been many compare and contrast studies to actually actively say by healthcare teams, professionals in areas of nephrology, for example, to say it makes sense to, for example, use FGF23. It does have an impact on bone. It has some, as far as my readings have been concerned, there is a link around bone mineral health as well with regard to FGF23, and in those who are still growing or still developing, for example, and I mean the younger people becoming going from, for example, toddlers to toddler age to sort of pediatrics, older pediatrics, and then going into from pediatrics into adolescence. In that particular age range, for example, FGF23 might be more appropriate versus creatinine, and looking at creatinine clearance. And cystatin C, for example, might be more useful or more appropriate in young adults, and the age range between, for example, and this is something that's in literature, so that's been estimated in some contexts, and that is to say the age range between, for example, adolescents all the way up to 45 or 50 years of age. And then creatinine clearance, and that's not to say it doesn't have a place anymore, of course it does, but because it's cheap and it's effective, health professionals are not going to suddenly change that, whereas scientists who do the testing and investigation would probably have a differences of opinion in one way, but I think that generally speaking, they would agree that there should be more of these biomarkers out there for looking at renal function or kidney function. There's another one called it's abbreviated as NGAL, is actually I think it's a gelatinase lipocalin, a biomarker that actually there has been some studies around this, and it's been published in the Lancet in an edition of the Lancet journal, and it's mainly in a study that took place in China, I believe. Chinese team have highlighted that is quite effective. So there's 3 or 4, maybe 5 different biomarkers that could be used, but between dare I say it, the UK and perhaps even the US. They're very much behind in nephrology practice in this regard, because they're still using the traditional creatinine and creatinine clearance, and pediatrics, pediatricians, and I think even other areas of nephrology practice would sort of know that, but have done, dare I say it, very little to update areas of practice. Now, I'm sort of going off topic a little bit, but just to say also that with respect to areas of nephrology, generally speaking, if there is someone who's at risk of having sort of those nephrotoxic side effects, monitoring, referral to a specialist services might well be necessary. And so use of nephrotoxic medicines or medication may be again may be appropriate in some individuals, and cannot be helped, because those drugs medications might be the only medications, for example, that treat particular symptoms and areas of physiology. Similarly, individuals again might apart from might benefit from the specific dose of medication adjustments. There should be consideration as to whether individual would sort of also benefit, find it advantageous to actually, and this is something that I still need to do some of my reading around, but if there are, for example, those sort of clinical trials out there to kind of be recruited into, then for example, if there are any clinical trials that are exploring comparing and contrasting different biomarkers to detect renal function across different age ranges or populations, then that would be something that some patients, for example, might find advantageous. And then, obviously, apart from that, I've mentioned how these different biomarkers can and should be could or should be used across different age ranges and population health, because the creatinine clearance and how creatinine has been used for some decades now, and sort of without questioning, it could give sort of a negative imposition on individuals' renal function when if, for example, a part of physiology, certain aspects of physiology might appear absolutely, for example, normal. sort of on this note as well, I've sort of wanted to highlight that there are where I mentioned, for example, certain areas of healthcare where patients certain patients or certain areas of population health where patients might have to take or more than one sort of nephrotoxic medication, though monitored as well. If that's the case, then there should be an understanding from clinicians and between healthcare sectors from an educational stance, because that has not really come out into the mainstream too much. I mean, it's nice that there are a sort of a national service framework for older people, for example, as mentioned, and other sort of publications that have come out by sort of lead authors around this subject, but that context really hasn't come out into the public domain, and that's in some contexts that's a bit of a that's a bit of a crying shame, so apart from this context, I'm sort of now gonna go into like providing a summary of points here. So sort of educational stance is important, and that does need to come out. Those focuses that relate to nephrotoxic side effects, and also different biomarkers. It needs to come out into that there has to be a focus really between health professionals and between health sectors to some extent about how that how certain compare and contrast type investigations could take place, if they do take place, and clinical trialists, and I've seen some of the work, I've seen some of the literature, apart from some of the context that's come out from the Renal Patient Support Group or the RPSG, for example. I have seen some context that come out from sort of renowned authors in areas of sort of nephrology practice, and it's a little bit unfortunate that kind of it's a little bit it's been a little bit slow from their perspective as to even the sort of the basis and understanding hasn't come out into the public domain, and that's a bit of a that's an area that could be and should be sort of hopefully improved. Drawing on areas of data science and sort of technology, and again, these areas aren't really my sort of not in my wheelhouse, and I don't pretend to be an expert in any of these things. But data science and those sort of techniques, and with technologies, they do have their benefits, but the sort of the educational stance and in different areas of healthcare should be commonplace, so individuals prescribed or and administered sort of nephrotoxic medicines and drugs that require dose adjustments, they do there is sort of a kind of a need to be addressed, where sort of any sort of data that comes out from sort of drugs and administration routines that they are actually sort of in a way where they can be sort of documented better or smarter. And there are I'm sure there are organizations that are doing that in some way or another. And in at least now where where better healthcare needs smarter science, it's really about where individuals, certain individuals or certain groups of individuals or certain areas of population health, and this is irrespective of background, race, and all those social determinants of or indeterminants of health, and areas of where areas of health have been compromised. For example, generally speaking, there needs to be a bit more understanding around different renal sort of at least from what I've read and trying to get my head around myself, is where certain individuals or groups and areas where areas of population health is concerned could benefit from more refined sort of laboratory screening techniques, such as again I mentioned one of them called cystatin C. I have there was a point in my reading, and what I did is I saw some understanding in literature in a paper that I read that highlighted that if cystatin C, for example, where it does have it sort of outweighs advantages over creatinine quite a bit, whilst that might be there is evidence and evidence bases around that, the problem is that on its own, because it hasn't been used retrospectively, and there's for example creatinine clearance, like I've said, or creatinine, and that biomarker has been used over 3 decades quite easily and longer, for a long time. There's data there to highlight and sort of links there to in areas of laboratory practice as well, to highlight that because it's a long-standing biomarker that's being used, cystatin C in one way or another looks more expensive from the onset, because it's and because of that factor, and there's no sort of historical sort of data around that, that actually it poses a problem for its use to be used in solitude or in replacement to creatinine clearance, and so therefore in one or two papers that I referred to, that I sort of read and sort of gone over, it highlights that cystatin C, if it was to be implemented, at least it should be initially used in line with creatinine, or creatinine as a biomarker, but then obviously I'm sure you're aware, dear listeners, that would actually probably impede on certain costs, and so therefore it's not going to be it has not been used sort of in the mainstream. Probably in sort of isolated cases it might well be used, but either way, if it was to be used in mainstream, there's not enough evidence to highlight that it can or should be used alone to replace creatinine, for example, outright, and that's a shame, because creatinine does not, as I've said, does not have might not have sort of as much as effectiveness as it once did, perhaps, on its own, as it once did, especially when there are other biomarkers out there and can potentially be bring more harm than good. And again, I don't claim to be an expert in these areas, but this is an area of science, but where there is more of a focus and a need for this a link and understanding, I think, is areas around where patients and again, I've read some of the works around the renal patient support group, where there are individuals, for example, who might be on certain medications, for example, immunosuppression, or those medications to prevent transplant rejection or anti-rejection. Obviously, clinicians make sure or have focus to ensure that those immunosuppression medications are within the therapeutic window and should not cause any sort of ill side effects. They do, unfortunately, that is the focus where these particular medications have use, obviously in sort of patients who have had for example, transplants. The cystatin C in that population hasn't really kind of come to fruition in any way, and areas of sort of even in areas of clinical science, which is actually the area of focus that that scientists sort of are able to provide understanding to clinicians to say, for example, that that particular medication can be completely withdrawn, or you can reduce the dose as well. Again, that sort of understanding is mainly is the clinician who makes the main change in area of healthcare practice on that side. But there are multidisciplinary team meetings that clinical scientists, for example, can get involved in, etc. Now, apart from all of that, I'm now going to share a few references, and you're all welcome to check these out at your own sort of leisure. There's a paper by Fowl. It's a little bit dated, but it's still a good one. It's in 2007, prescribing in renal disease, and it was published in I think it's Austin Journal of Austin Prescribing, I believe it is. I could be wrong by that, but if you check in your search engines, put that in, hopefully you find it. It's called the paper again is called Prescribing in renal disease. There's it's Fowl and Lee, Fowl and Lee, and then there's a paper by Foon, and it's a paper titled Chronic Kidney Disease in Elderly, and Chronic Kidney Disease in Elderly Assessment and Management, and this was published in the Australian Journal of Family Physician, Australian Family Physician. There's a book known as, at least in the UK regions, and it's known actually around the world now. Has been for a very long time. And there's an online edition of this book. is known as the British National Formulary, or BNF, and that is actually sort of a formulary that's kind of like almost the size of a handbook, really, that clinicians in a time before used to carry them around in sort of as I understand it, sort of as part of their teachings and things like that, and the same can be said between clinical scientists and pharmacists, of course. So the last one I looked at, I can't remember the edition actually, but there was the edition I looked at, number. I mean the edition, I can't remember the edition number, but I looked at it in 2019. There's also a paper publication by Blackenberg and colleagues in 2019, and this is titled "Patient Characteristics and Initiation of Mineralocorticoid Receptor Antagonists in Patients with Chronic Kidney Disease in Routine Clinical Practice in the US," and it's a retrospective cohort study, and it's published in BMC Nephrology. There is a paper by Masnoon and colleagues in 2017, and they actually literally, as I mentioned through this audio podcast, I mentioned, for example, the word polypharmacy. Well, they go Masnoon, his paper is a systematic review of definitions, and he questions what is polypharmacy. And this is actually published in BMC BMC Geriatrics. Then there is the National Institute for Health and Care Excellence, or NICE. In 2013, they published a document on acute kidney injury, prevention, detection, and management of acute kidney injury up to the point of renal replacement therapy. And I did not go into acute kidney injury too much, but nephrotoxic side effects can bring on or prompt acute kidney injury, or AKI, and that is why safe prescribing, not just safe prescribing, safe administration of medications, and safe screening, appropriate screening and timely screening to warrant off and preclude nephrotoxic side effects of particular medications and so forth. Why all of that is quite important to as well. So there's the National Institute for Health and Care Excellence publication in 2013, and I think there's an update on that one, is an update sort of framework around that. Then I mentioned the Department of Health in 2001. They had the National Service Framework for Older People, Medicines for Older People, and if you just type in a National Service Framework for Older People, there should be a link on that. I accessed that in sort of around June 2019. I mentioned Garish Vandi and the work that he did, or that team did, in 2015. They did a comparative assessment of here it is, a comparative assessment of neutrophil gelatinase associated lipocalin, and that's abbreviated as NGAL. So that's a biomarker. Neutrophil gelatinase associated lipocalin, or NGAL, and cystatin C as early biomarkers for early detection of renal failure in patients with hypertension. So, and that was actually published in a journal referred to as Iran Biomedical Journal, I think it is. And then finally, there's this is actually quite a good point of reference, and that is a paper by Zhang and that team in 2018, and it's called the They were referred as the Sprint Research Group, and it's kidney damage, biomarkers, and incident chronic kidney disease during blood pressure reduction. And this team actually provide perspective on a case control study, and it's annual. It was published in Annual Intern Medicine. And so that's where I'm going to draw this to a close. I hope you've enjoyed it. This is just the first audio podcast in this series by the Shientist on better healthcare needs smarter science, and this is about the molecular storm gauge. That's the series, and it's been another Ztorm Logistics production. Thanks for listening, and hope you gauge with some of the understanding that has come out from this. Thanks, and I look forward to putting out the next podcast audio in due time, and hopefully quite soon. Thanks then. Have a good one.